Hello everyone, my name is Brittany Ramsey and I am serving as our Region H Chair. Our region encompasses Ohio, Indiana, and Northern Kentucky, and this is the next course for our Advisor Development Training Program. This course is in our Diamond level for our more experienced advisors or advisors that have been volunteering with APO for a while, and this is titled Our Best Practices for Working with Chapters, really understanding tips and ideas shared from current advisors or volunteers and promoting that idea sharing amongst our region to better develop our advisors and our volunteers on how to best work with our chapters and support our students. We're going to start with a really quick recap on best practices that we went over in our very first course, Becoming an APO Chapter Advisor. So this is just a review of all the different best practices that we talked about during that course. Some of these include working behind the scenes and helping work individually one-on-one with students and making sure that we're not running anything or taking the place of a student officer or a student leader, and really just helping them behind the scenes with their operations, with advice and guidance and mentorship. Next, we want to provide thoughtful advice from multiple perspectives as chapter advisors and volunteers, and make sure that we're considering all the different sides to things and the historical perspective, as well as what's going on now, especially in 2020, and be able to provide those different perspectives and opinions and viewpoints to our chapters when we're giving them advice and guidance. We also want to be able to serve as an unbiased mediator. This means not establishing any personal relationship with the students and keeping yourself in an unbiased mediator in an alumni volunteer role and persona with the rest of the chapter, and making sure that you don't have a social circle develop within the students that you're supposed to be mentoring. Next, you want to help develop leadership skills in students, especially ones that even aren't serving in exec roles or elected roles within the chapter, taking the time to develop connections with potential new members or pledges and the rest of the active brothers in the chapter. If you can see a leadership skill or potential in a student and help give them the confidence to aim for an elected role, to take on a chair position, or maybe to help plan an event once in a while and start gaining that leadership experience, that's a really great opportunity that chapter advisors have, more so than any other volunteer, because you're seeing students on a much more regular basis and developing those one-on-one connections that you can as an advisor. Next, one of the best tips that some of our long-term advisors have given is to really make sure that you're working as part of a team with the rest of the advisory board. You want to make sure that you're working in tandem as well with local section chairs. Those section chairs are there to help develop the entire area. So they're working sometimes with 4 to 6 chapters to help connect all of the advisors within one chapter to another, to making sure that officers are communicating with each other across section, across chapter and campus lines and things like that. So advisors should be working with those section chairs to help stay connected with everything that's happening on that local level, what's happening outside the campus border, and even what's happening at the region and national level as well. And then lastly, to make sure that you are attending and participating in chapter events as requested by the chapter. Next, besides all of the best tips and the best practices that we can give for chapter advisors, whether you're currently serving or interested in becoming a chapter advisor, you want to make sure that you set up that meeting with your students to discuss what their expectations or even additional expectations might be. Every single chapter and every single campus and university is completely different from one another. There are chapters that expect their advisors to be at all their chapter meetings or to attend LFS events. Maybe they need advisors to be at their chapter bylaw discussions and election meetings. So you want to make sure that as a chapter advisor, you're setting up that meeting with your students to discuss what their additional expectations might be. The next important step, besides just figuring out what your attendance needs to be at events, is also talking with the chapter president and the rest of your exec board and the advisory board for what the communication structure is going to be for the year. Is the advisory chair responsible for talking with the president and figuring out a communication and attendance schedule? Are all the advisors supposed to be talking with everybody? Is that through email, by phone, by group message? So really making sure that that structure is set up and everyone understands what the expectation for communication for the year is, and that will help you in the future when anything revolving conflict resolution comes up, or when there's a question on attendance or needing help at the last minute. We know what advisors are supposed to be where and for what events. Next, you want to make sure that you're understanding how, as a chapter advisor, you're supposed to be representing the chapter on the section level. Does the chapter president need the advisory chair to attend any section events or talk on the section advisory chats, the email chains, things like that? I know typically that falls on the advisory chair, but every section is different. So you want to talk with the chapter president and especially the local section chair and figure out what they need you to do on that section level. And I know that that might not apply to all the advisors, especially like a community or a scouting and youth service advisor, but you definitely want to make sure that you understand what other commitments might be out there. For each of our 6 sections that we have, it's totally different. Some sections have email chains with all the advisors, some of them have group messages or group me, and some of them have Zoom roundtables. I know that we do that on the region level. At the beginning of every semester, we have a big advisor roundtable over Zoom. So everyone can kind of share ideas, input, talk about what's happened over the last semester and what's new, what's coming up, and what they need to prepare for as advisors for the upcoming term. Last but not least, you want to make sure that when you're a new chapter advisor or starting a new year as an advisor with your chapter, that you're discussing any university policies or restrictions that you need to be aware of for the chapter. Has anything changed, especially with everything that's happening with COVID? Are there certain restrictions the chapter needs to follow so that they don't get sanctioned or in trouble with the university as a student org? Are they one of our campuses that are dry? We have, I think, 4 out of our 28, 30 chapters are dry campuses, or student orgs aren't allowed to have drugs or alcohol, obviously, with their events. And so advisors definitely need to be aware of that, because that's a restriction outside of APO, and that's where university takes precedent, and we need to follow whatever their policies are. So these are just a list of questions to make sure that you're clarifying with your chapter presidents or exec teams, and definitely if you're not the advisory chair, talking with the rest of the advisory board members to make sure that everybody on your advisor team is aware of the expectations and you're all in agreement of how you're fulfilling those commitments to the students. Does anyone have any questions on our best practices or chapter expectation discussions for chapter advisors? Okay. Next, I wanted to open the floor for our first roundtable for this workshop. We have gone over just a few of our best practices that we've collected from current advisors and volunteers from across the region, but I want to hear from all of you. What are some of the best practices that either you saw from an advisor you've had, or something that you've done as a current advisor for the students that you think it would help a brand new advisor to the role? What are some of the things that you wish you would have learned maybe during your first couple of months of being an advisor? You can either unmute or you can put something in the chat.
I think, so for, I guess, context, I'm a new advisor to APO, but I've done advising for other organizations for several years as I work in higher ed. But I think in terms of the fraternity experience, I think communication with the other advisors is especially important because each of them are going to have a different level of commitment in terms of like their availability. Like for some of the advisors on our extension group, like I know evenings aren't going to work for them, and others like they're not allowed to come to campus due to campus restrictions. So just being able to communicate effectively between each other and understand that commitment looks a little bit different for everyone, but to still appreciate what they bring to the table and capitalize on the moments that they are able to contribute, I think is super important.
Yes, that's a really great point, and I'm glad that you're working with the other advisors and kind of building that team camaraderie and communication structure amongst yourselves. Does anyone else have a great tip that they've learned or that they've seen from another advisor during their time in APL? I will share one of the things that one of my chapter advisors said when I was a student. Now, mind you, this is like a decade ago, but one of the things that Brother Tommy Brennan said when he was my chapter advisor, he shared that in his APO Spark workshop that he does with a couple other alumni brothers, that APO should be the safest room on campus. And that always really stuck with me. And I know they were talking about having a safe space for people to share and to lean on each other and rely on each other. But in the face of the pandemic and everything that's happening with schools around the country and what's been happening for the past 5 to 10 years and beyond, I think it's really important that as advisors, we kind of communicate that to our students as well, that sense of safety and camaraderie and family that APO should be. If they're not instilling that in their pledge education program yet, or they haven't learned that themselves as actives, as alumni, volunteers, and as advisors, you can help the students really understand and see that sense of brotherhood that's outside of their chapter and outside of what they're doing on a day-to-day basis on their campus. Understand APO is this big family. It's supposed to be a brotherhood, which is a step above what a typical organization is, right? We're not just a service club, we're a fraternity, and we're supposed to be brothers and family. And I remember when my advisor was talking about how that was such an important factor to make sure everybody understood that the campus room or the room on campus that we had our chapter meeting every week, that was supposed to be the safest space for everybody on campus. And that really resonated with me. And I hope that sense, especially when we all get back to campus and having in-person events, that still holds true in all of the chapters that we have in H, that students feel like when they all come together with their APO brothers, that really is the safest place that they could go to on campus. Even if it's not a physical space, if it's a Zoom meeting or it's a phone call to another brother, they know that they have developed that sense of safety within their chapter. And I think that is something huge that you all as current advisors or potential or future advisors could do for your chapters, is really promote that sense of brotherhood, that unity, the family aspect, and really that sense of safety and belonging that I know a lot of people are searching for in these times. Does anyone else have something they want to share before we move on to our practice rounds?
This is something that I observed, I think is a strong quality of an advisor. So especially if you're on an advisory team, you might have close relationships with those people, whether it's personally, like you pledged together, or they were a mentor of yours because they've been an advisor for such a long time. But I think it's important. We had some concerns with an advisor, and many of our advisors had a close relationship with this advisor. And so we were afraid to go to our advisors to describe some of our concerns. There was one advisor who we knew was close, but we knew was going to at least listen to us and hear us out. And she was really able to provide some unbiased perspective. And even though she had a close relationship, say, here's what I'm hearing. And I wanted to make sure that even as she had a close relationship with this advisor, I wanted to make sure that our voices were heard and valued. And I think that's something that's really important in a team, is no matter your relationship with the other advisors, that you're able to put that aside for the betterment of the students and to help them navigate those spaces, because there is a level of power difference in a student versus an advisor, and helping them to navigate those spaces. And so I think she did a really great job, even though she had a close relationship with this advisor, helping us to navigate that space, and really trying to put her personal feelings aside to make sure that we as students were having a beneficial experience.
Those were a lot of great points, Rick, and I'm going to try and dissect just a couple of them, but you provided a really great overview of that power struggle that sometimes students face with their advisors. And as advisors, it's our responsibility to understand that and what our role means to students, especially working in college realms where a lot of them are over the age of 18, hopefully, and they're adults, and it can be very complicated, especially if you're a young volunteer or you're new to volunteer right after graduation. You want to make sure that you're understanding what that different level of mentorship needs to be. You're not here to have a peer-to-peer relationship as an advisor. You're here to be a mentor and a teacher and a guide to them. And then secondly, as important as we make it to form that camaraderie and build a team of advisors and feel like a cohesive unit to best support the students, you're absolutely right that advisors need to still remain unbiased mediators in and of itself. It shouldn't feel like one team of advisors against the whole chapter, and the students don't feel safe coming to any of you to talk about any concerns or to ask questions or to file a complaint to be transparent if there's an issue with one of the advisors. There needs to be a safe place for our students, and students always come first in our region. So regardless of advisors' allegiance to each other or to each other as alumni volunteers, students will always in the end come first no matter what, especially in our region. And we need to make sure that we understand that and respect that as advisors. We are supposed to be the safe space. You all need to be a safe space for your students and someone that they feel like they can come to. And if the students don't feel like that safe space is respected or a possibility with you, then it might not be a great fit. We might need to move some advisors around to different schools based on feasibility. But whatever is in the best interest of students is what is going to happen at the end of the day. But those were really great points. Thanks for sharing, Rick. Anything else before we dive into practice? Okay, perfect. Thank you everybody for sharing. We're going to move into our practice rounds. Like I said, since this is a diamond level of webinars for our advisors, it involves a lot more of the real world practicing to prepare us for any of the situations that you might need to be prepared for when working with students, to make sure that we put our best foot forward as advisors and alumni volunteers. So I'm going to give us, I think, 5 scenarios, and I would love any input. You can do it through the chat or by unmuting and sharing live what you would do in each of these different scenarios as an advisor. So in our first scenario, you are a brand new advisor to a chapter, and it seems like officer transitions are rarely taking place. The outgoing officers aren't sharing info with the newly elected officers, and there's a huge lack of transitioning happening between programs. How can you help the chapter start an officer transitions program to better prepare and support the chapter? And let's pretend the chapter and president is on board, they want your help, they're coming to you to ask for advice.
I can start, I guess. So I think with this one, obviously there's like a transition resource from the national fraternity, which I think would be the first starting point to point a president to. And I think, right, obviously as an advisor, we have seen transition from multiple chapters or just from our different experiences, but I would want them to do some internal benchmarking. So think about their transitions in high school or other organizations that they've had on and participated on campus. What have they seen be successful? What did they like? What didn't they like? How can we implement that into our organization, knowing that they're the student and they're going to know the fine-tuned details of the operations, like what can we bring in that they have seen be successful. And I think that's a great thing for them to also lead a conversation with their executive board of like, what are things that they executive board members have also seen from their other org experience as well, because there's no need to necessarily reinvent the wheel, but it's about finding something that's going to work for this particular chapter. And so I think that would be like the starting point for beginning conversations, at least for my approach.
Yes, that's a great start, and I love the direction that your approach is going in. And I love sharing national resources. We've got region resources too. There's so many starting points to where you as a chapter advisor don't have to feel like you've got to reinvent the wheel, or start from scratch and try to figure out how to even lead a discussion on officer transitions. If that's not something in your experience or in your forte, even like if I ever have a question come from a student or an officer about parliamentary procedure, I always go take a look at the resources that we have, because that's not something that's in my repertoire. And so I always point everybody in the direction of the resources that are already developed to help you in those different realms. So we've got an officer training and transition PowerPoint for the region, which helps you conduct a transition virtually, which is what most of our chapters are having to do right now. And there's national resources too about officer transitions, and there's an officer training PDF, I think, for almost every role now. So it's a great starting point to read through and learn. So you could use or advertise both of those with those students. Zach added that he would recommend they start a transition manual using resources from the National Fraternity and the knowledge of the position from their experiences. They can pass down the manual to the next elected officer. That is a great idea. I will add, because a lot of chapters tend to lose things in transitions if they're making a binder or a manual and they're saving it online somewhere and it doesn't get transitioned down, it kind of leads to that same problem a few years down the road. So if they don't already, I always recommend students, officers, staff volunteers to set up a Gmail account for each of their positions and then save a Google Drive, and then they can share that Gmail after every single transition. So like the service VP could have utservicevp@gmail.com and save everything onto the drive, including information about the officer role, their past experiences. Maybe they have a lot of contacts they can add into the email account, and then any training resources from the National Fraternity and from our region and sections as well. I also recommend that maybe the advisory chair keep a list of all the passwords. That way no one ever loses access to those Gmails either. They should be property of the chapter, so you can help by having an advisory chair oversee that as well. That's a great point, Zach. I love the idea of a transition manual. Go ahead, Michaela. Do you have something you wanted to share?
Yeah, so I kind of started to do this kind of like this past semester. I felt like it was kind of an issue going from like the spring to the fall with new elected exec members, and we didn't really have a transition period prior to. It was more like a reach out to us, we'll be here next semester, but kind of it was difficult at the same time for our students because some of those people that said that they would be there as an exec that next semester that ended up not being exec wasn't there. So I kind of utilized those resources that National gave out, and I kind of set it differently due to COVID so that I had each exec member have like their own, like we set up a meeting individually. So it was like president with like the last president, or like VP of service with the last VP of service. And one thing that I did was that I utilized Google in doing this by creating a folder for each of the exec members, and then having that transition that we talked about inside of it, and putting like the year it was done, and hoping for the future that for the semester that we'll do the same thing, so that they can go back on it, look at it. And it's some things that it's like, it states like the typical, what does your position do, as well as what is it, kind of like your goals, what do you wish you would have done, what do you think would be a good idea for the next position to like, the person taking over, and so that they can go back on that to look at that as well.
That's great, and that sounds like a really strong transition program. So that's something that, as a chapter advisor, if you were to go serve at another chapter and they didn't have something like that in place, you can help build from your experience and share those ideas with the new chapter, because I think those are phenomenal. Deirdre, do you have something too?
Yeah, I think like in addition to what resources the national office has, what resources the campus has is also important. Like my alma mater, we had like a Carlow University email account for our group, and so we tied like our Gmail account that had our Google Drive with all of our like records on it to that email, so that if the password got lost, like a student could just go to the IT director on campus or the IT department on campus and get the password reset. So there, like even that issue was not an issue because we use the campus resources. So I think like the campus resources are also hugely important, and stuff like having a student activities locker and things like that too really help.
Yeah, definitely. And if your chapter or university is fortunate enough, like a few of ours are, to have an office on campus, or if they have student lockers or trophy cases, like old trophy cases the universities aren't using anymore, that chapters can lock safely their items in and things like that. Those are great things if you're a faculty or staff advisor, or you're an advisory or advisor member and you can take that idea to somebody who's working at the faculty or staff level to see if they can help work with the university to find those resources for the students. That's really one of the core reasons we have faculty and staff advisors, not only to put us in good standing with universities and keep us apprised of any university policies, but also to help with all of those campus resources. Any other ideas? Those are all really great suggestions. Perfect. We'll move on to the next scenario. This one says that we recently saw a presentation on Robert's rules and realized that the chapter you're advising has never implemented any structure during their elections. With the chapter election coming up next month, the chapter president thinks your suggestion to utilize Robert's rules is a great idea. What training or resources could you help provide to the Sergeant at Arms to get them started? I will give you all a starting point. I would say, especially since it's Robert's rules and parliamentary procedure is not everybody's biggest skill in APO, unless it is, and that's wonderful. Your first go-to, if none of the advisors on the team are familiar with it, would be your section chair. They're a really great representative to help tie you with any other question that you have that your advisor team can't already help with or know where the resources are. If you're unaware, I would go to your section chair and they can help get the answer to you. There's so many different Robert rules guides online. You can Google them. I know there's a book that you can have as well, but there's definitely really quick stats. And there's lots of sites out there. So you and the section chair could work together to find a good website that has information that's easily readable and understandable for our students and send that over to them for a great starting point. That's one option. Have any of you ever sat through an elections or seen something that the chapter needed help with or you needed help with as a student that you could share that tip with the Sergeant at Arms?
I think something that I really try to remind my students, and this happens in like other contexts, not necessarily in an APO space, but like when I was training them on parliamentary procedure, reminding them like you set the pace of the person who's like chairing that space, and it's like okay to take a time out or to like take a 1 minute like internal caucus or have them do whatever you need to do so that way you can get your bearings if you need to look something up or things like that. I think that's super important is remember you set the pace with those. But I also encourage them to write out like a script or like a base foundation of like, okay, here's the order of things. And then if this happens, here's what I do, just like a cheat sheet. And like you said, there are a lot of like cheat sheets out there, but I think it's easier if you have one that's very specific, that's almost scripted to what you could say so that if you get lost or you don't know what's happening, you can refer back to your own like internal script. Or if you're really that nervous, you can read off of it too. I think those are two things that I've always encouraged people because I don't think parliamentary procedure is as intuitive for some of our students as it is for others.
Definitely, and I love the idea of having a script beforehand. That's definitely something that I would do, and I continue to do. I like having the script in front of me. It's just not something that I'm naturally comfortable with when it comes to Robert's rules or parliamentary procedure. So I can imagine it's the same for a lot of our students. So that's a really great idea. And you could work with them as a chapter advisor or with your section chair or maybe a team of advisors and help them come up with that script or maybe some kind of catch-alls. Like if you know that this might come up, the biggest tip I ever got and that I always keep in the back of my head was about amendments. And when an amendment gets proposed, you need to discuss and vote on that first. And sometimes we skip over it and go back to the rest of the actual thing. And so I always have that in the back of my head. Like if an amendment comes up, I know exactly what I have to do because that's happened once and I had to get walked through that process as a student. And I've never forgotten what the advisor helped us walk through back then. Any other tips? Okay, perfect. Our next scenario is the chapter that we're advising has a robust service and fellowship program. However, there has not been an emphasis placed on leadership for the past several years. Since leadership is one of our cardinal principles in APO, we're worried that the chapter isn't offering anything regarding leadership development to its members. How would you start a conversation with the president and exec committee about your idea to include some type of leadership program?
Well, I'd probably start with the question of what leadership activities have they been doing, and depending on their answer, which I imagine in this scenario hasn't been as many, that they can probably just start with that and see also what they've been doing too, and start from there with some brainstorming about what are some potential ideas that they could do, like maybe some resume building workshops or something similar like that, just to get started and kind of start getting some feedback from the students on if they like them, and then just kind of use that as a building block based on the feedback they get to build from the ground up a good leadership program.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of times too, if a chapter hasn't been doing something for a couple years, like if they haven't been doing pledge education, they probably have no idea what the pledge manual is or what APO history means. They've just been showing up and doing service on campus for a couple years. And hopefully that's not the case. But if it's been a few years since the chapter has done anything with leadership and doesn't have an LD program, or they're not sponsoring leadership events, chances are your exec team or the older actives, and especially all the new members, they're not going to know what leadership development means to APO. And so, Zach, you had a great point of suggesting some ideas, whether it's campus speeches or workshops, resume building things. They might need to learn first what leadership development even is in our fraternity, and what does it mean to have a leadership event, what can fall under it. Because it's not just workshops like we're in right now, building skills in APO. There's lots of other leadership development courses or workshops that a chapter can host that have absolutely nothing to do with fraternity operations or programming. It could be personal development, like resume building or networking or learning how to utilize LinkedIn and things like that. So I think that's a really great starting point, is figuring out, have they done anything at all? Do they know what it is to begin with? And then giving them some past ideas or things that other chapters or other sections do.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
When I was an active brother, my chapter did not have a leadership program until we started interacting with the other schools in Pittsburgh, the other chapters in Pittsburgh, and what Kappa and Beta were doing really inspired our chapter to figure out, like, oh, we could do those events too, and like that makes sense because leadership's one of the cardinal principles. And so I guess connecting with other chapters that have leadership programs that are already established, that are nearby, would be a really good, it worked for us.
Yeah, that's a great tip. And I'm sure our section chairs on the call love that idea, because that helps inspire interchapter relations. It helps connect them with programs that are already built and structures. So it's again, sharing ideas and being brothers and kind of working together to be of service and not having to reinvent everything from scratch. I can't tell you in 10 years of being an APO how many times I've seen a chapter start from scratch or think they have to write a pledge manual or write down the history of APO and not realize that it's all saved somewhere. Someone has a copy. You can get it from another chapter, from the national office, things like that. Just like LD programs, there's probably an example one that they can start with and tweak it to make sense for their campus. It's a great suggestion. Does anyone else have any feedback for this scenario? Okay, moving on to our next one. The local section chair has been emailing your advisory team with a list of section events with nearby chapters. It doesn't seem like any students from the chapter you advise are attending or even responding to the section chair. How can you help motivate the students on the exec committee and in the rest of the chapter to get involved with interchapter relations, especially with things being virtually this year and a lot easier, at least travel-wise? You can just hop on a Zoom instead of having to drive. So how would you motivate your students?
I feel like I would provide some examples of some of the interchapter events that have been going on and just kind of show what's been going on, and just the brothers have been having fun with it or what they've gained from it, and just trying to really market it to the students as something that's worth their time and very beneficial to them as brothers and as students to do, so that can hopefully motivate them to get out and go to an event. And I feel like once you just get the students out to a couple events, it'll hopefully start to encourage them to go to more and more in the future.
Definitely. I love the suggestion of sharing either past experiences or having other brothers share experiences if they've been to past interchapter events. You could show photos like from a formal last year or a big trip to Cedar Point or something that the chapters have been doing. And this year I know everything's virtual, but there's been so many fun interchapter things that are happening still online too, whether it's trivia nights or escape rooms. things like that. So you could definitely help advertise it that way by showing examples of what's already been going on. Any other tips for motivating students? Deirdre added that an advisor could also suggest that the section events could be counted towards the members' leadership, fellowship, and service requirements, and that's phenomenal. So if your chapter has service hours or leadership, fellowship event hours that they need to complete, they can get those done with other chapters as well. That still should count as a fraternity event, even if the exact service UP from your chapter wasn't the one who planned it. That's a really great tip, and completing hours is also always a great way to motivate students, especially if they know they have to get things done. Hopefully it then shows them this whole new world of interchapter relations and they fall in love with it, even if they started attending them because they had to. I've always said too, especially when we get back to conferences, whether they're virtual or in person, if you can get one student to go with you, especially as an advisor, if you get a couple to agree to come and you guys take a road trip together, or you encourage the students to do it together, always in groups of more than 3. But if you can get everybody together to go to a conference, even if it's a small group, they will get there, they'll fall in love with APO, they'll see all the different things that there are to do, they'll make so many different friends with chapters hopefully nearby and far, and they keep those connections alive and go back to campus and they're like, I have a new best friend, they're from Kentucky or they're from Texas, and we're gonna set up a chapter event because I'm really good friends with that one student I met at a conference. And then it's this snowball effect. Sometimes all it takes is getting that one student or a couple students to a conference or an interchapter event for them to fall in love with it and bring that APO spark back to the chapter. Michaela had a great point. She is the president of our Zeta Lambda chapter at Toledo currently, and she said she knew that Wright State University put on a Jeopardy game for the Diabetes Awareness National Service Week event, and her chapter promoted it as kind of a 2 birds with 1 stone. It was an interchapter event, but also a service to the nation opportunity because it was a diabetes awareness event. So that's a really smart idea too, that it's kind of encompassing 2 of their requirements or 2 facets of the fraternity in one, plus you get to meet friends from a new area. Jackie also suggested helping promote the event on your personal pages. If you have students on your social media or you run section accounts, if you happen to have other roles than just chapter advisors, you can definitely spread the info online. Rick added that you could do a chapter of the week where you feature a video message or a PowerPoint slide highlighting a nearby chapter. And that's a really awesome idea for our chapters. I love that idea, Rick, and I feel like we should bring that up on our section chair call. But you as a section chair or volunteer, or even on the chapter level as an advisor or president, you could highlight all the chapters in your section or in the region so that your chapter members get to know who all is around you. I can say when I was an active, we had no idea what our section was or who was in the section. There wasn't really a lot of section camaraderie or structure back then. And now to see it 10 years later, there's chapters that talk to each other even across section lines, across the country, across regions. It was amazing to see because we never had that feeling when we were students or that experience. So that's definitely been, especially in the age of technology, such a great benefit to, I think, the experience in APO as an active. Rick also included one of my favorite tips of all time. The quickest way to change something with a chapter, and I can't believe I haven't said this yet, but the quickest way to change something with a chapter is to incorporate it into the pledge education process. So I know a lot of times when something is not going right in the chapter, or the chapter president or one of the program VPs wants to make a change or improve morale or get people to start caring about something like interchapter relations, if it hasn't been a big deal before in the past, they keep lecturing the seniors or the older actives, the main part of the active brotherhood. They keep lecturing them on why it's important and giving them all the spiels we've been talking about today. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But the quickest way that you can start changing your chapter is by changing your pledge education process. if you have a whole new group of students come in to pledge and they're taught that interchapter relations is this really cool, exciting thing, and it's so awesome to get to see chapters from all over the section or the region or the country and get to know them, and it's really important to do so to get that experience of a national fraternity, really an international fraternity at this point. And if it's a requirement or not, or it's just something that you ingrain in them that it's really important, that's all your pledges are going to know. And then what happens when they initiate into brothers? They become brothers that really care about interchapter relations because that's what they were taught when they joined. So the quickest way that you can make any kind of change spur in the chapter that you're advising is telling the exec board to add it to the pledge education process. Thank you for suggesting that, Rick. And then Michaela added that she's not sure who started it, but she knows a chapter nearby started a pen pal program, and a few members were extremely excited to talk to somebody else across the country and see what they were doing. It allows brothers to connect and want to reach out and meet people from all over the place. So a pen pal program is a really great idea. And yes, it's also a bonus on the Pledge Program of Excellence Award. So if you don't have anything with interchapter relations ingrained in the chapter that you're advising or soon to be advising, you want to make sure that they take a look at interchapter relations to realize why it's important for their programming. Oh, I love this. So many great ideas. Thank you, everybody. Okay, and our last scenario. Let's see. The chapter we're advising has struggled to find voting delegates to attend conferences each semester, and students don't seem interested in APO outside of their campus. You're concerned that they're missing a huge piece of our fraternity by skipping conferences. What ideas could you suggest to the exec committee to help promote conferences to the rest of the chapter? And I know a lot of those ideas we just talked about with interchapter relations apply. But for those who have been to conferences before, how would you reiterate that importance, especially once the conferences start happening in person again, and we kind of have to start teaching the experience to probably a whole group of students who have never heard of conferences or seen them in person. All they know is Zoom. If you think about us going probably 2 full years without conferences, the amount of seniors that have probably seen one, which was last year, is going to be a very small group of active members. So how will you start that education process and promoting process?
I think something that I think is important, and I know not all chapters can do this, but oftentimes chapters will build into their chapter budget that they will like pay for the voting delegates, at least the registration, not necessarily lodging like some of those other pieces, but at least the registration cost, which can help students to be more inclined to go if they are voting delegate, and right then incentivizes some of the wrong people, but especially for chapters to integrate like a nomination system. I think often helps them say like, okay, who are people that we feel embody our cardinal principles or represent us as a chapter, which sometimes that is the officers, but oftentimes it may not necessarily be. But I think that is a great way to start it. And then especially if you don't have money in the chapter budget, I've seen where they've done some outreach to alumni to do like a GoFundMe, or chapter advisors have pulled together to either write grants or things like that to help and fund students to go there. But I would say I think that is often where a lot of it stems from, is that cost piece. And so I think really helping them to break that down or realize, right, here's how we're going to help you fund it. Like if you have a genuine interest, like let's go. Because I think sometimes the most dedicated members are the people who can't afford things. And so really helping them to realize the reality of it, especially if they aren't necessarily a voting delegate either, like what are opportunities for them to go specifically. So I know that doesn't really address the question, but I think that is important to add in there as well.
Yeah, it's an added benefit for sure. And if a chapter's budget can do so, or if they're looking for different things in the future after events start coming back to life and they're able to host them, if they're able to support or sponsor voting delegates, that's a really great way to encourage engagement and also offer more accessibility, because there's probably students that want to go and want to serve and represent their chapter and might not be able to financially be able to feasibly do that. Deirdre adds, as our region finance chair, she says, building costs into chapter budgets is a great idea. And financial support can always be a huge way to help promote things to students. I've seen chapters that even do conference scholarships, where chapter members have to write in an essay on what it would mean to them to go to the conference or what they're most looking forward to get out of it, things like that. And the exec committee will choose a couple to give out scholarships.
Borrowing from the earlier ideas from interchapter events, you could use the workshops at the conference as either, if your chapter does a leadership point system, or potentially for service hours or fellowship. When you come back, you can use that just to kind of help meet the requirements for your semester. So that could help too.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a great suggestion as advisors, and it's probably something students don't naturally think of. But to think of service hours outside of the box, and how are different ways that we can be of service besides, actually actively volunteering at a service project. One of our pillars is service to the fraternity. And besides doing fundraisers or helping run or plan chapter events, one of the easiest ways to get a service to the hour point for service to the fraternity could be attending a workshop, because you're really taking the time to develop your skills in APO to better your chapter's development. So that's a way to kind of think of service outside of the normal ways that we do, and open it up and encourage students to develop themselves as leaders as a service to their chapter in the fraternity. Deirdre added that her university student life office had a special budget as well, just for sending students to leadership conferences. So it'd be really great if you're a faculty or staff advisor, or you can recommend that to one of the members in your advisory team to look into something like that. That's a key part of being a faculty and staff advisor, is finding those university resources that the fraternity doesn't see from the outside and probably doesn't know about. It's probably not advertised on a regular university webpage. So you want to make sure that you're advertising that to your students and encouraging them every year to utilize what's already available for their usage. Michaela added that the biggest part is just informing the students of what conferences can provide. A lot of times I've seen on chapter meetings that happen virtually, or I see copies of their PowerPoints from in-person meetings in the past. They talk about conferences, and the chair or the leadership chair for the conference or for the chapter gets up there and it's just like, hey, reach out to me after this meeting if you want to go to this conference. It's this weekend, it's going to cost this much money. Send me an email if you want to go. But they don't ever give a presentation on what the actual conference is or what happens there. And if there's not a lot of members in that chapter who have been recently, especially within the next couple of years in our fraternity, our advisors, we're going to have to lean on heavily and rely on you all to be able to share experiences and photos and explain in detail what conferences are like and what they used to be like. Rick also added that you could invite the section chair or whoever's planning the conference, a committee member, to come and speak, and putting a face to it can really help people get to go. If they come to the chapter meeting or a chapter event to speak about the conference. I remember when we planned one, our chapter had a sectionals back in 2014, and we drove to almost every single chapter meeting in the state of Ohio. And back then that was almost 20 schools. And we just stopped into a chapter meeting, sometimes 2 in one night across the state. And for 5 minutes, we would run up to the front of the room. We'd show a little PowerPoint with pictures. We'd hype everybody up about the conference. And I think we really tripled our attendance by doing that and putting a face to a name and making it a personal invitation. So if your chapters can get creative and do things like that, especially now that we have like back then we didn't have Zoom, and now it's so easy to go step in virtually and visit a chapter that you don't go to and share messages. So when we get to next spring and we have a virtual sectionals conference weekend, just like this weekend, hopefully the conference committee can be set up with each of the chapters that you're advising to come by and kind of hype it up. Deirdre said they had a great section chair when she was a student in Pennsylvania that would always bring snacks or a fun activity for the chapter, and everyone loved seeing her. She was always a friendly face, and that's wonderful to hear. That's what we want to see from all our section chairs. And the same goes for our chapter advisors. I always recommend, even when things are in person or if they're over Zoom for the next year, whatever happens, make sure that you don't become the advisor that just shows up to the meeting, sits in the back of the room, and never talks to anybody. You want to make those personal connections. You want to reach out. I've seen a lot of chapters that have PowerPoints now incorporating advisors. So at the end of the meeting, before they do the toast song, they'll have a space for advisor comments. Maybe they'll put a picture of them up and some notes about them, or how to contact them. So it still keeps them top of mind, if that makes sense, and still keeps them present within all of the chapters' minds, chapter members' minds. So when we get back to being in person, you can still be that fun-loving, friendly face that the students are used to seeing over Zoom. Ooh, Rick mentioned a good point. You could always do a competition between chapter members or with the chapters in a section and do like a road warrior or a man mile award. That's really the award for who brings the most members to a chapter, things like that, like a distance competition. So you could do that within your chapter as well. This will be my shameless plug for our Region H Frequent Flyer Award. We have little flyer pins, like the wing pins that you used to get for like flying on an airplane in the 90s or the early 2000s. And if you make it to a chapter meeting or event in all 6 of our sections, you can get a pair of wings. So that's a great incentive to take back to your chapters as well. And there's info on that on the region website. But that's exciting too, even for conferences or for just regular chapter, interchapter events. Okay, perfect. Now I'm going to open up the floor. Thank you all for your input on the different scenarios that we had. You had a lot of great ideas and suggestions, and hopefully that makes you feel more prepared for serving as a chapter advisor and even in the future being able to train and onboard new advisors to your group. Does anyone have any questions, or do you want to bring up a scenario you've been through before and want to get input from the rest of the group? Now is your chance. Okay, I have a question that I will use from one of our presentations yesterday on how to increase engagement, especially virtually. So I'm sure a lot of you, if you've sat in on any of your chapters, virtual meetings, participation is quite hard to do over virtual entities like Zoom. So what are some tips or activities or things that you've seen your chapters doing that have helped increase participation or spur communication happening over Zoom calls, whether it's a chapter meeting or a chapter event happening online? What are some tips that you've seen?
For the chapter I'm potentially becoming an advisor for, Michaela would always sometimes ask questions to the entire chapter about like maybe how was their weekend, or is there something you were looking forward to, or something like that, and everyone would answer, and that'd be a good way to get everybody engaged and everything.
Yeah, that's a great way to start off meetings. Any other tips for virtual events or meetings? If you are serving as a chapter advisor or a potential advisor, how do you engage with the students over a Zoom meeting? I've seen one tip. I was asking in our group me chat with the rest of the presidents in our region. I saw our region marketing chair was sharing an idea about starting with a game, just like Zach was saying. You could do a like run and find it game to start it off, and you could name a lot of different items, whether it has to do with APO or not, but you could ask everybody to run and whoever gets back to the camera first wins or something like that, and you can rack up points. But like run and grab something blue or from your last vacation or something with letters on it or APO, and do kind of a fun game to get everybody moving and engaging. And if you ask your chapter president as an advisor to try and host something like that, maybe at the end of the call, it's a really great way for the chapter members to get to know who you are, put a face to a name, and to encourage that excitement and enjoyment of the fraternity. And Jackie suggests you could ask questions, have them inbox you with the question to kind of start a little Q&A dialogue with the students. That's a great way to get them engaged as well. Zach added that the chapter has a PowerPoint slide where he can give a report and say some things. And he also tries to participate in any of the events that the chapter is doing. And then Rick adds that one of the chapters in H1, which is Northern Indiana, they use something called Flipgrid, and they feature a Brother of the Week. And that's a really awesome way to highlight the brothers in the chapter too. And if they could do that with advisors or section volunteers or even highlighting other chapters in the section, that's a great idea to take back as a chapter advisor to other areas as well. All right, well, thank you all for making it through our next course. You have made it through one of our diamond level courses, as you can see on the list here. The attendance form is loaded on the Region H website under the virtual RVC, so you can check it out there and reach out if you have any questions on that. And then I've put my contact info here, as well as our advisor chair for region staff, if you need any additional support or training. Thank you so much for going over best practices for how to work with our chapters in APO, and I hope this helps you feel more prepared for real world situations with our chapters and our fraternity brothers as students. Thank you all for joining me. Please reach out afterwards if you have any questions, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.